In city after city across the Muslim and Arab world, protesters are venting anti-American fury over a crude anti-Islamic film. It was made in the United States, but it may be rooted in a long simmering religious conflict inside Egypt. Brian Todd is here. He's been looking into this part of the story for us. So what are you finding out?
Well, if that conflict is between more hardline Islamists in Egypt and members of the Coptic Church, the largest Christian church in the Middle East, there are suggestions that cops were involved in the making of this movie. There is no connection directly between the church itself and the film, but the mere implications have been very provocative. At the genesis of all this violence, a poorly made film called Innocence of Muslims, a movie depicting the Prophet Muhammad as a violent buffoon, a movie which may also reflect growing tensions between Islam and the Coptic Church, the largest Christian church in the Middle East. U.S. federal officials believe the man who made the film is Nakula Basili Nakula, who was convicted 3 years ago for bank fraud. A production staffer who worked on the movie says the filmmaker also went by the name Abanab Nakula Basili and said he believed he was a Coptic Christian. The staffer says the filmmaker told him he'd been in Alexandria, Egypt, where the Coptic Church is based, raising money for the film. The suggestion that cops were involved in the movie inflamed Egyptian media.
Islamists' use of this idea that cops were behind it was apparently effective in drumming up support for those attacks.
Analyst Eric Traeger and a Coptic Church official tell us there's no connection between the Coptic Church itself and the movie. But the film was promoted by a man who identifies himself as a Coptic Christian, Egyptian-born anti-Islam activist Morris Sadiq. In an interview with the Middle East Media Research Institute last year, Sadiq said this:
"Every Muslim knows that he is one of Egypt's occupiers."
CNN has tried repeatedly and unsuccessfully to reach Morris Sadiq. An official with the Coptic Church here in the U.S. told us the church strongly condemns this film. The church issued a statement calling the movie abusive and part of a malicious campaign to divide people. As for Morris Sadiq, the Coptic official said the church has no connection to him and certainly doesn't sanction what he says. Egypt's Coptic Church is roughly 2,000 years old. Coptic Christians make up almost 10% of Egypt's population, and there's a long history of animosity between them and radical Muslim groups. The bombing of a Christian church in Alexandria last year killed at least 21 people. Another 24 Coptic Christians and their supporters were killed last fall in clashes with the Egyptian army. How far back does this tension go, and what's the reason for it?
The reason for the tension is, I think, really due to the violence that cops have experienced, both under the previous regime and since that regime collapsed. And I think that has really fueled mistrust.
Traeger says it's estimated about 100,000 cops have tried to leave Egypt since the revolution last year, the main tension wolf being between the cops and members of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a more hardline Islamist faction in Egypt. Of course, that group is now the ruling party in Egypt.
Yes, it is. What more can you tell us about this filmmaker?
Well, that staffer who worked on the film told us that he is married with 2 children. He says that this filmmaker has had several aliases, and we've been going through his aliases now for 2 days. He was arrested. He was convicted in 2009 for bank fraud, and we're told the FBI has contacted him because of possible threats against him, but we're also told he is not under investigation right now.
Brian, thanks very much. Brian Todd working this story. Less than 2 years ago, we watched as these kinds of protests spread across North Africa and the Middle East. Protesters fighting to overthrow dictators and regimes. Fast forward to today, we're seeing these same countries erupt in violent anti-American protests. Let's bring in Bobby Ghosh. He's an editor-at-large for our sister publication, Time Magazine. He wrote this week's new cover story, The Agents of Outrage. It's an excellent article, Bobby. Thanks very much. And let me read a line from your article. The Arab Spring replaced the harsh order of hated dictators with a flowering of neophyte democracies. But these governments, with weak mandates, ever-shifting loyalties, and poor security forces, have made the region a more chaotic and unstable place, a place more susceptible than ever to rogue provocateurs, fomenting violent upheavals, usually in the name of faith. I guess the bottom line question, Bobby, did the Arab Spring make that whole region even more dangerous than it used to be?
I think the evidence is now in, Wolf, that at least in the short term, it certainly has. These dictatorships in the old days could be relied upon to crack down on any kind of protest with maximum brute force. Democratic governments, as we know, cannot do that if they expect to be reelected. And the other problem is that the new governments don't, I think, have full control over the security apparatus, which is divided in loyalty between the old regime and the new one, and was not especially good in the first instance. So these are new problems for the Middle East, and I suspect that for some years to come, before there is a sort of democratic culture that emerges, for some years to come, there are going to be incidents like the one we've seen this week, where things very quickly spiral out of hand. The political leadership don't know how to deal with it. The security apparatus are completely overwhelmed, and lives, American, foreign, or even Egyptian, are put in harm's way.
As we look at these live pictures coming in from Cairo right now, not far from the U.S. Embassy, Bobby, here's the question. This so-called film or trailer that's out there on the internet, this anti-Islamic film, is that the excuse for what's going on, or do you feel it really did trigger these protests?
It's only the start of a chain. Look, it's not a simple matter of somebody putting a video on YouTube and the street in the Arab world erupting. There are provocative things said about Islam and the Prophet online every day, every hour of every day. You don't see riots breaking out every day. There are a set of people working behind the scenes, sometimes at cross purposes, sometimes people who don't really necessarily have the same agenda, who crank up this hatred. So you have a filmmaker in California, you have an extremist pastor in Florida, you have a Coptic American Egyptian in Washington, D.C. They bring this thing to the attention of the Arab world. Then you have a television host in Egypt who is well known for inflammatory comment, who picks up on this and then magnifies it. And then you have political groups, you have religious groups, and you have armed militias on the ground who then take that in Egypt and in Libya and run with it. So this is organized. This is not spontaneous. This is not random. There's a sequence of events that leads to 4 Americans being killed in Libya, and it's not accidental.
Not accidental indeed. All right, Bobby, excellent article, the cover story in the new issue of Time magazine entitled The Agents of Outrage. Bobby Ghosh from Time magazine. So did the United States ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, he was obviously murdered in Libya. Did he have enough security? One Libyan politician actually warned the ambassador about that on the very day that he died. We have details straight ahead.